FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr here, live on Montana Talks. Commissioner, great to see you.
Oh, thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I saw the picture of you at the Sip and Dip in Great Falls, and his work here is done.
I tweeted that picture out. It's been one of the most popular tweets of my time out here. So, as you mentioned, I work at the Federal Communications Commission, and our biggest focus there is getting more rural broadband deployed to bridge what we call the digital divide. And getting outside of D.C., there's nothing that beats that, to see what are the challenges that remain and what can we do to make sure every American in every community gets a fair shot at this connectivity.
I've heard you're kind of the guy who wants to go in there to the FCC and get rid of some of these stupid, archaic rules that have just been around, and people are like, well, why are these rules still here? Because nobody ever got rid of them.
That's exactly right. When I came into this position, President Trump nominated me in 2017, was confirmed by the Senate, and we took a look around, and the U.S. is in this big competition with China when it comes to technology, particularly this next generation of wireless called 5G. It's going to be a lot faster, and we were at risk of ceding U.S. leadership to China because we had backwards-looking regulations. We need to build out a lot of new cell sites, and some of these are very, very small. They're backpack-sized antennas that can go on, for instance, utility poles. But we had these rules at the federal level that treated every backpack-sized antenna like a 300-foot tower. You had to go through these federal environmental, federal historic rules, and China was putting up cell sites back then at 13 times our pace because of our rules. And so we came in and cut over about about $4 billion worth of regulatory costs, and cell sites now are going up in this country at an accelerated clip.
Well, I was sharing some news about former Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke, who was a former congressman from Montana, and he would joke about this, well, not actually be serious about this out here on the campaign trail in Montana, and I've seen the same thing. We've been in places like Iraq and Afghanistan where sometimes you have better cell coverage than you have in parts of Montana.
That's true. Yeah, we were all the way up from here to up to Great Falls and everywhere in between, and you're going around and you'll see 4 bars on your cell phone down to no bars, down to 1 bar. And I'll tell you, when you step back as a country, we're actually doing really well. And in fact, broadband is being built out across this country at an accelerated clip. I was in Utica, Montana, actually a couple miles outside of Utica, and there's about 100 miles of new fiber that's being plowed into the ground, and that's great news. But if you don't get it to your actual home, to your ranch, it may not feel like we're making progress. But the reality is the policies that the Trump administration have put in place, the policies that we're putting in place at the FCC are working. Internet speeds are up, more cell sites are going up, and we just got to keep the hammer down until every single community sees that benefit directly to them.
Yeah, in fact, I know you're going to be cruising around later today with Congressman Greg Gianforte. Of course, knows a thing or two about high tech after starting Right Now Technologies in Bozeman, Montana. But we have joked previously, because I asked him his thoughts on 5G one of the times he joined us here in studio, and he said 5G. He's like, I'll be happy with just a G in some areas. Let's just get some forward progress. So hopefully it sounds like. So what does it actually take from a technological perspective to get us to 5? What does 5G mean for those of us laymen out there? I mean, we'll see 4G on our phone, but what does 5G actually mean, and what is it going to take to get there? How many new sites does that mean here in Montana? And at the end of the day, who pays for those new sites? Who pays to install the fiber, all that stuff?
It's a great question. When we get there to 5G, obviously your cell phone's going to be potentially 100 times faster. That's going to be great. But the real benefit is we need to upgrade the wireless network to truly enable the Internet of Things. And when you look now at the farmers and ranchers, particularly on the smart ag side, you have these combines now that can pull in just massive data. Well, we got to get 5G built in to pull that data off of the combine, analyze it, and then help deploy precision ag. From a network perspective, it's going to look different. So for 3G and 4G, where you have it, it's relatively few towers. They're the tall 200, 300-foot towers that can spread a signal over 30 or 40 miles. With 5G, we have to layer on top of that 10 to 100 times the number of cell sites. So it's a big infrastructure challenge. It's a big infrastructure build. And in 2017, there were 13,000 new small cells built in the country. 2018, last year, it jumped to over 60,000. So that's why I say we're on the right path of building out this infrastructure. And in fact, it's a great job story. These are good paying jobs building out this infrastructure. And we have an initiative to try to help leverage some community colleges to create a pipeline for folks to build this out.
We're talking with FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr here live in studio. He's been in Montana all week long. In fact, it started off, I think, in the Missoula-Kalispell area, and I saw a great video that I think you shared. You got to see some of our great Montana smoke jumpers getting ready. It looked like what we in the Army might call JMPI, doing kind of their pre-jump inspections and checks and things like that. So I guess talk about some of the highlights of your week so far.
It's been a great time. So we started in Missoula with Senator Daines, and one of our first trips was to a telehealth facility. And you think about the lack of rural hospitals across the country, across here in Montana, rural hospitals closing by the dozen. That's one area where these next generation of connectivity can make a difference. Rather than having to drive 6 hours to the closest hospital, you can have a specialist that through a broadband connection, sometimes a video phone, can see you, can pull data directly from you, and treat you right in your home. And so we're looking to see what we can do to support that at the FCC. Also, public safety communications, as you mentioned, spend time with some of America's best, the smoke jumpers out there in Missoula. And they, more than anyone, go into the most rural, the most remote areas, and they're put there for days and sometimes weeks at a time. So talk to them about how we can make sure we're doing our part back in Washington to support their mission.
Yeah, and they're dependent on emergency communications as well, because if weather conditions change in a heartbeat, they have to know so they can get their men and women out of those specific areas, know where to move and when to move, or they actually probably are the ones communicating that to everybody else since they're on the front lines and can see exactly what's going on. You talked about smart agriculture as well, and man, I've talked with some incredible producers here in Montana. You know, some of the different technologies that are being implemented. I mean, you talk about these. I mean, really, almost every tractor and combine anymore is a smart car in itself. And so, what have you seen from the agriculture perspective?
That's another one of the great upsides to making sure you have broadband connectivity. You know, on these farms today, you can collect silos worth of data. You've got soil sensors, you've got drones that can pull images, you've got these combines that, based on GPS data they're getting, can make inch by inch adjustments to seed depth, to where to apply fertilizer, saving money, increasing output. And it just underscores that we need to make sure there's connectivity everywhere. From my perspective, places like New York and San Francisco, they're going to see next-gen connectivity no matter what we do back in Washington. But that's why we've put such an emphasis on getting out of D.C. and putting communities like this front and center. You know, winning this global race to 5G or next-gen connectivity means making sure that everyone here sees it, and that's what we're working to do.
I know one of the questions is, how do we define rural? You know, when we talk about rural broadband access, you know, in fact, former Senator Conrad Burns, who, you know, was a big part of the Telecommunications Act in the mid-'90s, he was kind of famous for saying there's a lot of dirt between light bulbs here in Montana. And so, you know, our definition of rural in Montana might be different than, say, some of these big, large national wireless companies who, you know, they might say, oh, well, rural is Bozeman, rural is Kalispell, whereas we're like, no, those are urban areas. And so when you have these large companies saying, well, we're going to provide rural access, okay, are you talking about, you know, rural Montana being like what we would consider these large cities, or are you talking about rural Montana where those farms and ranches that feed the world are located? You know, a lot of economic output coming from places where there may not be a lot of people. So I guess talk about the differences between a geographic standpoint versus a population standpoint, rural versus urban.
Yeah, that's our goal, is to make sure that every community has it. And that's why Senator Daines, we spent time with earlier, he's been such a great leader for Montana, as you know as well. He's got a technological background. So does Congressman Gianforte. And I think Montana is really lucky to have both of them serving in Congress, because they hold our feet to the fire at the FCC to make sure, you know, we're not stopping at Missoula, we're not stopping at Billings. We got to push beyond it. And the network might look slightly different. So when you have population densities, we need more cell sites to drive more capacity. Out in rural areas, you have to use what we call, to get wonky for a second, low band spectrum that's going to propagate over further distances. So it's going to be a mix of different cell site deployments, different spectrum bands that we're going to use depending on population density. There's also this new generation of satellites that are now launching, and we'll see if that makes a difference. Satellites have a history of overpromising and under-delivering, so we're not putting all our eggs in that basket, but it'd be nice to get some more satellites up there to see if we can boost capacity.
Yeah, I'd be remiss too if I didn't also ask. You know, we you know, we'll be heard later. You know, on several radio stations are between 9 and 10 a.m. We're on. And now over 20 signals across Montana, great radio stations, and a whole mix of different ownership. Some are local, you know, some are locally owned, some are owned by larger companies. Just a nice mix. But I think our radio stations and our local TV stations, to their credit as well, they know that if we stay focused on our local communities and putting out important public information, all that's how we're going to best continue and stay alive moving forward and compete, even with the big dogs down the road. But that being said, I think I know in talking with some of our fellow broadcasters across the state and friends with the Montana Broadcasters Association that there are concerns about, hey, do we need to make sure that there aren't too many stringent rules in place that make it harder for local broadcasters to be able to compete with some of the national firms.
That's right. There's nothing that beats live and local, and that's one of the greatest things about radio is be able to have these conversations. You live in the community. People can hit you up at the grocery store, tell you what they think is important, and you can cover it. Again, at the FCC, when we came in, we had a lot of backwards-looking regulations that still assumed that Americans get their news two ways. Once in the morning when the newspaper clunks on the doorstep, and at night when they tune to one of 3 broadcast television stations. The media marketplace is vastly different. You're competing with Spotify, with Pandora, online offerings. And so we've been trying to update and modernize our rules because it's more important than ever to make sure we have investment in news gathering and local news coverage. Because when you look at local newspapers, they're struggling across the country. So we need to make sure that radio continues to have the ability to invest and compete in today's marketplace.
Yeah, and oftentimes those very regulations can be used against local broadcasters, but yet help those big tech companies, who are competing in this, like you say, this media marketplace that we have here. Let's see. What are some of the other questions you're getting as you travel across Montana?
Well, one thing we hear loud and clear both here in Montana and everywhere else that I've traveled is robocalls. Americans are sick and tired.
That was one of the questions I wanted to ask you about because I've gotten some tweets about that, and I know that's a big message that Congressman Greg Gianforte is talking about this week as well.
Exactly. Yeah, Americans are sick and tired of getting robocalls. As we're traveling the country here, and we'll probably put about 800, 900 miles on our rental car this week. When we do get a signal in some of the most remote parts, one of the first calls that comes in is a robocall, and we get it. We get them ourselves. We're tired of it. We're actually voting at the commission next week to empower wireless carriers to take more aggressive action to stop robocalls. We're making some progress. We're taking enforcement action, but we haven't broken the back of this robocall epidemic yet. But I can tell you that we have it on our front burner, and we're working to address this issue.
Yeah, I mean, one of the best things I've done with my own cell phone is I have visual voicemail. So every voicemail I get, I can see basically what that text is. So if I don't know who's calling me, I'm not even going to answer the phone because 9 times out of 10, it's probably a robocall, some spam jerk somewhere. So I just don't even answer it. And if it's really that important, they'll leave me a message. I can read it. And even if I'm in a meeting, I can be like, okay, I better call that person back right now. Or, okay, I'll talk to you later. Or send them a quick text or something like that. Going back to this 5G discussion, and you talked about how China has basically been kind of moving much faster in the world of 5G than we have. How do we position American companies to compete in that regard? I mean, yeah, we want to be 5G, but at the same time, it's like, heck, let's look at most of the stuff that a lot of the stuff that American consumers are purchasing comes from China. So how do we compete with China when it seems like everything is made in China in the first place?
Yeah, there's 2 pieces of this. One is how do we get the network built out here in the U.S. first? And that's one area we've been updating and really getting the government out of the way. And cell sites now are going up at an accelerated clip. Just one reform we did, they started going up 6 times as fast. We've closed, in a lot of respect, that infrastructure gap with China. By the end of this year, we'll have 92 5G builds in this country. China has now announced plans for 0. So we've really closed that gap. The second piece that your question touched on, though, is the security of our network. When you have equipment manufactured by companies owned by the People's Republic of China, and we have a proceeding in place right now at the Commission looking at do we need to rip this equipment out of the U.S. networks? Is it not a sufficient security threat where we need to impose the cost of doing that? But we're looking very actively at threats that might be presented by having Chinese equipment in the 5G network.
Yeah, and if they do have to replace that, is there going to be support for them replacing that? So probably a whole host of questions that you'll be looking at then.
Yeah, there's a bill
the weeks and months ahead.
Yeah, in Congress that would set aside some funding for that. When we were in Great Falls, we were in Malmstrom Air Force Base, and obviously they got 150 missile silos up there. and there's been some news coverage on concerns about equipment from a Chinese-owned company being used to provide cell service in that area, and does that pose some sort of threat?
And moving forward, on the 5G front, I guess how would you say that Montana? Where do we sit on the 5G map right now? What do we have? What don't we have? And what is anything maybe you can announce that's maybe coming this direction? Yeah,
5G is continuing to roll out. Right now, last year we had 14 cities. I don't recall if any of them were in Montana. I don't believe they were, but we're pushing to 40 cities this year. I'll have to take a look on where that is. One thing that I think we can do, we have this transaction before the FCC. Sprint and T-Mobile are looking to merge the 3 and 4 nationwide wireless providers, and I've announced I'm going to vote for that when it comes up for a vote at the FCC, particularly because of your question. They've committed to accelerate the build-out of 5G, including in rural America, and to me, that's a big win if we can accelerate that build-out to places like this.
Well, and of course that depends on how they define rural America also, because, the Washington Post had a fun piece about a year ago on, kind of where I call my hometown, and Glasgow, Montana, and all these several northeastern Montana towns that they referred to as, they collected all this data and they said, well, this is officially the middle of nowhere.
Yep.
But yet, hey, you talk about the cattle that come out of there, the wheat, the peas, the lentils, the pulse crop leaders here in Montana and the nation. And so there's a lot of, our country is, very dependent on what comes out of that part of the world. And so,
right.
So today, let's see, you're going to be at a livestock barn. You're going to be heading out to Forsyth, Montana. What questions do you hope to get answered today?
Yeah, this is still on our push to make sure rural communities get next generation connectivity. And so by getting our feet on the ground, talking with some broadband providers, talking with consumers, we can see what are the hurdles that are left. And we never know exactly what we're going to learn, exactly what we're going to pick up. But every time we do these trips, we get back to Washington, we have new ideas that we can help get across the finish line back there.
All right. FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr, thanks for joining us here in studio, and enjoy the rest of your trip here in Montana. Great to have you with us.
I appreciate it. Thank you.